Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Shareholder revolt at BP today. Investors have given a big thumbs down to a £14 million pay deal for Chief Executive Bob Dudley, rejecting it by a huge majority. 60% of shareholders voted against the company's remuneration report, which included a 20% pay hike for Mr Dudley, despite the fact that BP has just posted huge losses and axed thousands of jobs around the world. The vote isn't binding, but BP's chairman told the meeting, "We hear you." Here's our business correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi.
An English historian once said, "Abused patience turns to fury." Perhaps that's what pushed shareholders at BP over the edge today.
Morally questionable.
It's such a ridiculously large sum.
A high increase at the moment I thought was inappropriate.
Today's shareholder revolt was much bigger than anyone was expecting. The chairman opened the meeting by saying he was listening, and there was plenty to listen to. Inside, angry investors started demanding answers about the morality of paying Mr Dudley £14 million. They'd already been backed up by institutional investors, and perhaps that's why, even before we knew the results of the vote, BP were already promising a root and branch review of the way they pay their staff. Bob Dudley will receive £14 million for last year's work. That's an increase of 20%. But BP lost £3.6 billion over the same period, and Mr Dudley announced 7,000 jobs would go. So does he deserve a pay rise?
It was a PR disaster. The system, the whole system in the United Kingdom, indeed in the world, needs to be changed. Senior people in a company must not set their own remuneration.
Well, this matters because it sends BP completely back to the drawing board on its remuneration policy. It sends a wider signal to the rest of the corporate community. You cannot be rewarded for failure. Shareholders have lost a huge amount of money.
While BP was backed into a climb down on future policy, the company defended its decision to pay bonuses this time round, insisting that Mr Dudley and others had significantly exceeded the metrics set by the board. In fact, if you stripped out the settlement made last year to resolve the Macondo well disaster, then the company actually made a profit. Plus, say BP, many of the pay metrics are now tied to safety, something activists had called for. But it's not just BP facing questions. Rakesh Kapoor of Dettol to Durex company Reckitt Benckiser received a £23 million pay package last year. The company justifies this by pointing to £20 billion of shareholder value created over the same period. But that's dwarfed by Sir Martin Sorrell at WPP, who is set to receive £70 million, the biggest package in the FTSE 100. Though again, he can argue that the company is making profits and the value of the firm has doubled. Before you get too excited, it's worth noting that today's vote is non-binding. A big element of what's happening today is political, because the very pay package that shareholders are criticising now is the very same thing they failed to influence back in 2014. That's when 96% of them voted through the deal. Now, surely fund managers could have calculated what might end up happening.
We would benefit if a lot more shareholders were very active in their voting, more so than they are today.
But Royal London, like its peers, still believes the main responsibility lies with the board to curb bonus excesses, not with investors to dictate policy.
The issue here is not with the policy itself, it's how it was implemented. So for us, it's how the board used its discretion.
The controversy over pay is set to heat up this AGM season. The focus will not just be on boards and their executives taking 180 times what the average person in the UK earns. It will also be about the stewardship of long-term investors, custodians of our pensions and supposedly the guardians of corporate governance.
Helia Ebrahimi reporting. Well, with us now, Nicola Horlick, Chief Executive of Money & Co. And in Westminster, Kate Andrews from the Institute for Economic Affairs. Nicola Horlick, how do you read this £14 million? I mean, you know something about large pay packets in the past.
Well, I have to say I'm very pleased that the shareholders have voted against it. Unfortunately, it's not a binding decision. Every 3 years with most companies, there's a binding decision about things like this. But this particular year, it's not a binding decision. But I would think that the board will have to think very carefully before ignoring what 60% of the shareholders are saying.
But 96% of the shareholders voted for this pay package when things were rather dire for BP. They're still pretty dire, but they're less dire than they were.
Well, they voted for a framework, and there was some discretion within that. And I think it was ill-judged of the Remuneration Committee not to see that there was. I mean, because there have been noises going on for some time from the shareholders about being dissatisfied. So to have ignored that, I think, was a little bit foolhardy.
Kate Andrews, ill-judged?
I agree that today's decision is the correct one. The shareholders have really put a check up against the board. They've questioned this large amount of money going to Mr. Dudley, and that is absolutely the right action. Shareholders have an investment in BP. They saw that profits weren't where they should be. They saw that there was the potential for job loss within the industry, and they decided to take action. This is exactly how executive pay should work. If companies are bringing in billions in profit and CEOs are being paid millions, well then, you know, they're receiving a very small fraction from what they're bringing in. And that benefits everyone across the globe. At
the top of the programme, I mentioned the fact that chief executives in the FTSE Top 100 list of companies are paying $5 million average to the average CEO. Admittedly, the 14 million is a lot more even than that, which is 180 times that any worker earns.
Well, I think it's
the whole thing is out of control. Is this the moment of there's going to be a turning point?
Well, to think that there's a big pot of money, and if we take money away from the CEO, it will automatically go to rising the pay of workers at the bottom, that's just fundamentally not true. My biggest concern is looking at the pay of workers at the bottom. To do that, we have to talk about the productivity puzzle. We have to talk about the cost of living.
I can hear the workers saying, what about the productivity puzzle of the people at the top?
And that's why it's so important that decisions like today are made, that CEOs, when they do have such big salaries coming to them, have checks on them. And if they're not performing, they are the first to go.
Right.
That's what's fundamentally important, that shareholders today weren't just looking out for profits, they were, but they also saw that BP was being risked with job cuts.
Nicola Horlick, is this a turning point? Could it be a turning point? I mean, is it time that something was done about these vast salaries?
Yes, it is a turning point, I believe, and I think it is time that something was done about these vast salaries. And also, I think we should remember, when we talk about the shareholders and the people who voted today, most of them were institutional shareholders acting on behalf of smaller shareholders. I mean, a lot of people will be thinking, well, this doesn't really affect me. I'm not a BP shareholder, but they actually probably are.
They are.
Because if you've got a pension, or if you've got an insurance policy, or if you've got an ISA with some fund in it, you've probably got some BP, because it's such a big company, it's held in all portfolios.
But what are these institutional investors doing? I mean, people like Legal & General and the rest of them who are having to handle all these things.
Yeah,
You'd have thought that on our behalf, they'd say, hang on a minute, it's not a very good deal for the pension.
That is the big question. Why have they been so reticent to do anything about it in the past? And that's why this decision is actually very key and very important. Even though it's not necessarily binding on the company, it raises a flag. And it's all companies in this country are going to have to take note of what's happened today.
But, I mean, in a sense, you were digging in the garden before many of these people were at this. But, I mean, didn't it all start years ago, and it's now just got completely out of control?
Yes, and I think probably the people to blame are the headhunters, because they started talking about, oh, well, you know, it's an international marketplace. We have to pay what people are paid in America. And of course, their fees are based on what someone's paid in their first year.
So, Kate Andrews,
can I interject here? I'm really confused as to what we care about. Do we care about what people are earning at the top, and what is essentially an arbitrary figure? Because here in the UK, as the Office of National Statistics showed last week, once you account for taxes, that income inequality gap closes significantly. So do we really care about that number at the top, or do we care about salaries at the bottom? And if we care about salaries at the bottom, what we need to be talking about tonight is the productivity puzzle, is why housing is so expensive, is why childcare is so expensive. But talking about pay at the top, in my opinion, is very much a smoke and mirrors issue. It's talking about how unfair society is, but actually trying to get into that high pay issue and trying to cap salaries at the top will do nothing to help people at the bottom.
Kate Andrews, thank you very much indeed. Nicola Horlick, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
I've been getting